Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Soybeans are found on dinner tables around the world. Some form of the soybean is found in baby foods, snacks, cooking oils, and many other food items eaten daily. And soybeans provide the protein in the diets for livestock and fish. The Nebraska soybean farmers support research to develop new soy-based products for foods, livestock, and industrial uses through their checkoff dollars. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We're coming to you from Nebraska's Sandhills, the 14th annual open house at UNL's Gudmundsen Sandhills Laboratory near Whitman. On this episode, Jim Robb analyzes the current state of the cattle industry. Jerry Volesky updates us on the condition of central Nebraska's pasture and rangeland. Jenny Reese talks about how corn yield could be affected by late planting and the consequences of frost damage. Bruce Johnson explains why Nebraska's livestock sector isn't meeting its full potential, and Lauren Giesler shows how you can scout your soybean fields for Phytophthora. Jim Robb from the Livestock Marketing Information Center is our cattle market analyst this week. When we were at this open house a year ago, it was towards the end of a brutally long and expensive summer for farmers and ranchers. A short corn harvest and a previous drought in Texas didn't help either. Now, pastures are in better shape, and a potentially record-setting fall harvest could be on the horizon. But the losses this cattle industry has sustained are impossible to ignore.
Well, it's kind of difficult. We have a great diversity in the U.S. industry. Prior to this most recent drought, though, we had estimated per cow returns would be about $135 per cow. That's return over cash costs plus renting pasture, so not including all costs of production. That number translated in after this most recent drought to about $35 per head. So we lost well over $100, $130 per cow of our income earning potential due to the higher costs in a drought year, and because we had in the most recent drought year low corn crop and high corn prices, our cost of production also went up. So we kind of had the worst of both worlds and the biggest economic impact because our cost of production went up in the drought and our calf prices went down.
What does it look like going forward for the feedlot and for the cow-calf producer? Does it look like it gets any better here?
I think it certainly does, and we never know what Mother Nature's going to dish out. But if we have a normal year, our costs of production in cow-calf country are going to go down, and certainly our prices of calves are going to go higher. The supply side is very supportive of higher calf prices, and the consumer still looks rather favorably on beef, even though we're going to get a lot of competition from pork and chicken. So the cow-calf sector set pretty well. It's going to be a struggle to recover from 2 tough years, much of the country of drought. On the feedlot side, we're still in sort of the throes of 2 years of consecutive, almost monthly losses, one after the next. A year ago at this time on closeouts, our estimates would put the per head closeout on a cash basis, losing nearly $300 per steer. Now we're losing $50 to $60 per steer. We're certainly towards the end. But these feedlots have been very aggressive in chasing the calf and yearling market. Even though their corn costs are starting to move lower, they've started to bid that away pretty quickly. So the cattle feeding sector seems to be not, in a bit of a transition point of time and not really out of the woods yet.
The corn is kind of the wild card. If everything goes well, it could be a record crop, but if there's an early frost across a widespread portion of the Midwest, this could really get ugly. So do you have any advice for...
Well, certainly we're looking at a much bigger corn crop than last year. Where we have the frost worries start in parts of Iowa. They're poor corn in parts of Iowa into states like North Dakota. The eastern corn belt, we've already made the crop. But there's still a lot of yield potential out there that could happen either plus or minus this year, and that'll be important to how the prices finally set out. And that's really important for the livestock sector because that cost of feedstuffs is usually the largest component of cost of production.
Still see something in that $4 range?
I think we'll have $4 on an annual average, and we could push, if we do get a late frost we can push corn in the cash market, in some of these cash markets, into the high 3s. So that's a real dramatic change from the last 2 or 3 years.
I think we talked about this last year, but you mentioned it again in your presentation today. Consumer consumption continues to go down. At what point does that become a concern?
Well, consumption, to an economist, consumption's a big part of the story. That's about half the demand story, because demand is also the price that consumers are willing to pay. That consumption keeps going down, largely just reflecting smaller production and bigger exports in the U.S. We're still a pretty big beef eating country, but we look ahead to next year, 2014, and U.S. pork production will outpace beef production for really the first time in relevant history. So it's a concern as we look ahead. I think we know a lot of the reason why consumption went down, simply because our production went down. The question becomes, in the long term, can we get beef prices high enough? Will the U.S. economy grow fast enough that we can take beef prices even higher and add some profitability to the beef sector? That's really the major unknown looking ahead, is how fast the U.S. economy grows will drive that demand for beef component.
If it doesn't, does that push consumers to other meats like pork and chicken?
It certainly does. The pork and chicken, especially the chicken sectors, are already ramping up aggressively. And there's going to be a lot more competition at the meat case, and especially in the second half of 2014. And again, if the U.S. economy is growing, consumers will sort of stick with beef. But if we start to stumble, they're going to have a pretty big incentive to move to pork and chicken.
The last numbers we have from the USDA on cattle are at the beginning of January of this year. The next ones we'll see at the beginning of next year, since there was no mid-year report. What's an educated guess as to what you might see for the state of the industry?
State of the industry today is that the cattle inventory is down from a year ago. Our estimates, because again, as you mentioned, USDA did not do a report. We take this forward through the end of the year, even with a pull down in beef cow slaughter, we'll have a year-to-year decline in the size of the U.S. beef cow herd as of January 1, 2014, and probably a decline in the total cattle population. And we'll probably start to try to hold back heifers again this year, as we have the last 2 years, try to stabilize that process. But the cards are largely already dealt, and the beef cow inventory on January 1 will be smaller, probably on the order of 0.5% to 1% smaller year to year.
Next week, we'll take a look at corn and soybean markets with Elaine Cubb. The latest ratings show Nebraska's pasture and range is worse off than better. 34% is rated as poor or very poor. This area last year was not a pleasant place to be for a grazing cow, but in our discussion with Jerry Volesky Thursday here in the Sandhills, he notes these sections are now in much better shape thanks to nearly normal precipitation.
Well, here in the west central part of the Sandhills, certainly things are looking much better this year compared to a year ago. Here at the Gudmundsen Lab, for example, last year with that severe drought, we had only had about 4.5 inches the entire April through September growing season. Here this year, and even just through August, we've had about through July, excuse me, we've had about 3 times that, or nearly 12 inches. So things are much improved.
Is that close to average?
Yes, it is. Very, very close to average in terms of what we've had this growing season.
What did the pastures, what do the ranges look like in terms of, were they able to recover, or did you lose a lot of plants from that grassland?
Right, and it does vary across the Sandhills from west to east. I think here where we are, it's the grass has got a ways to go yet. I noticed it certainly is a lot thinner. Just the density of grasses isn't there like it normally is. And probably the other key thing that catches most everybody's mind or eye is the amount of weeds out there, or forbs as we like to call them. In this area, a primary one is the annual sunflower. So the hills are just yellow, but there were a number of other species of annual weeds mostly that just really thrive this year. And that's not uncommon. We've seen that before in terms of the year after a drought. Back in 2002, for example, we had a pretty significant drought in most areas, and then in 2003, it was very similar. Not quite as prominent as it is this year, but and the way I like to describe it in terms of drought and the rangeland plant communities, it's like a disturbance. Okay, so it's a disturbance that really shocks that range plant community, if you will. And other kinds of disturbances, you can have some things similar happen, like a wildfire with some bad timing, or a very severe hailstorm in a small area, very heavy grazing. Things like that are all disturbances, and then you get these kinds of responses.
Anything that is overgrowing weed-wise that needs to be taken care of?
You know, for the most part, people do ask about that, the abundance of these annual weeds. I tell them really not to worry about it. They do have some value in terms of what they're doing as far as providing some cover, residue, and litter, which most of these sandhill soils really need. They like to have some residue litter on the ground to really help conserve moisture, keep soil temperatures cooler. And so next year, hopefully, if we continue our more near average rainfall pattern, there'll be a lot fewer of those weeds, and those grasses will continue to cover better yet.
What does the hay supply look like out here?
Hay production in terms of many of the sandhills meadows has been variable. Here at Gudmundsen, we were really quite pleased in terms of the yield of hay that we were seeing. And I've talked to several other producers in the Sandhills area that also indicated that they were pretty impressed with their hay production off the meadows this year. But then again, there were some locations that a little disappointing in terms of the hay yield. It probably has to do a little bit with the meadow and the extent of sub-irrigation that any individual might have.
We'll have more from this open house in next week's show. As I mentioned in our marketing interview with Jim Robb, there are two drastically different scenarios that could easily play out for this year's corn harvest. If the USDA's numbers prove true, the U.S. will produce 13.8 billion bushels of corn, a 28% increase from 2012. But the other avenue is an early frost that finishes off a late planted crop. While Nebraska's corn is in better shape than the national average, a UNL corn simulation model shows farmers who planted their irrigated corn late could face a yield reduction anywhere from 0 to 13%. That's partly due to the strong chance of frost before harvest. Near Grand Island Wednesday, we talked with Jenny Reese about how the hybrid maize model is forecasting the rest of this year's growing season.
What it does is it looks at a 30-year long-term average weather conditions, and it tries to predict what's the best situation, perfect conditions for highest yielding corn. And it will also do 25% of average or of best, 75% in a median as well. And so when we say perfect conditions, we're saying no limitations on water and nutrients, no disease, so perfect conditions.
So under perfect conditions, if you planted around the average time for corn in an irrigated situation, what does it show?
So an average situation in this case, we were assuming around mid-May for an average situation this past year. And with that, it was showing throughout the state actually up to 10% yield increase above the average, 30-year average. So that sounds pretty good for irrigators, but at the same time we need to realize those are perfect conditions, and we know that there are less than ideal conditions throughout the state too.
Right. What if you didn't plant on the average maturity? If you were in one of those fields that was a little wet and you couldn't get in there right away, then what does the model show?
So if you planted later after Memorial Day, then the yields are actually dropping off pretty heavily. And part of the reason for that is the increased frost potential that comes into play at that point.
There's also some things with the weather that we've had. This is not like last year where it was brutally hot. It's been more cooler, but that's also maybe helping the yield.
We do have cooler temperatures this year, and so part of what the model is doing is it's looking at, okay, what is the potential for a long grain fill period? If we think back to 2009, we had that long grain fill period that allowed for high yields, but it was late harvest too. So that comes into play. But also, if you think about this year, we've had high solar radiation. We've had minimal cloud cover, a lot of high solar radiation. That led to increased yields last year too, as well as lower nighttime temperatures.
What does dry land show in a dry land situation if you planted on average and if you planted late? What are the differences there?
Dry land, whether you planted on average or late, if you plant late, basically you're seeing a bigger yield drop off than if you planted on average. But really, dry land, it's basically where you're at in the state and what range you've gotten, and that's what's going to come into the biggest factor there.
Because it's so hit or miss.
That's right. It's been really scattered as to who's gotten rain and who hasn't, even within a couple miles.
How strong is the chance of frost because of this late maturity? And that's kind of the reason that you're looking at this. How strong is the chance of frost throughout the state? And it probably differs.
It does differ throughout the state. We have a Crop Watch article on that, cropwatch.unl.edu, and it ranges in some cases in northeast Nebraska up to 70% later that you planted. So we're hoping that we don't have to worry about that or think about that, and we'll keep you updated on Crop Watch throughout the rest of this growing season.
As Jenny mentioned, you can find the detailed yield forecast on the Crop Watch website. We'll also link to that story on the Market Journal homepage. The state of Nebraska ranks first in commercial meat production. It ranks first in cattle slaughter, second in cattle and calves, and second in cattle on feed. It ranks 7th in commercial hog slaughter, but doesn't break the top 20 in milk production. While Nebraska's livestock industry still makes up a good share of total agricultural production, it's not nearly as valuable as it once was. And that impacts the other side of ag, corn and soybean production. At last week's Soybean Management Field Day in Waterloo, Bruce Johnson talked with us about Nebraska's so-called Golden Triangle, the symbiotic relationship between Nebraska's livestock and its crops.
Well, livestock has always been important in the state, and probably a decade ago, when we looked at the value of ag output, that maybe 60% or more of the ag output would be livestock versus crops. What's happened in the last few years is that now livestock might be probably 35 to 40% of our total agricultural output. So it's been a switch in terms of emphasis.
What all plays into that?
Mainly in the last decade, we've ramped up crop production amazingly well. And to be honest, higher commodity prices too, which raise the value of that. At the same time, that higher commodity price leads to higher feed input costs, and so the livestock industry was growing at a much smaller rate.
So is that something to be concerned about?
It is. What we're getting at with this idea of a golden triangle is that you have the corn, you have the oil seeds and soybeans, you have the biofuels industry, but in that triangle, but within that triangle that ties it all together is livestock. And livestock can be really very fundamental to the future viability of our state's agriculture.
How does Nebraska compare with, livestock growth to Iowa, Minnesota, states like that?
Well, certainly we're strong in cattle, and we probably in 5 years will be #1 in terms of cattle on feed numbers. And for obviously reasons, because of the biofuels industry and the distiller's grain as a co-product of that, and that's one plus for Nebraska. On the other livestock components, we are really losing ground relative to our neighboring states. And one good example is fed hog numbers up maybe 3% in Nebraska over the last decade, and Iowa ramped up 31%. And they are basically 8 times the volume of hog production that we are over here. And likewise in Minnesota, in South Dakota, we are seeing that in hogs. Dairy, we continue to see a decline in our dairy industry and dairy cow numbers. And at the same time, other neighboring states are far ahead of us in expanding this new scale of dairy production.
So corn would have, if you look at the 3 uses for corn, ethanol,
Right.
exports, and then livestock, if Nebraska
Yes.
would start to increase that, the livestock on feed, that would be successful there. But I want to make sure I got a stat right today. Did you say 80% of soybean meal, Nebraska soybean meal, is pushed out of state?
As best as we can estimate at this time, yes. 75 to 80% that is produced here leaves the state as an export. A lot of it to Iowa
Yeah.
and our neighboring states, which are ramping up the hog and the poultry for industries.
To close out with, you said today that we're not taking advantage of Nebraska's ag complex. Is there something that needs to be done? Is there something that should be done to move that the other way?
There certainly needs to be an awareness of how important the economics of our agricultural system is, and how important livestock is to that, and the opportunities for expanding that economic viability. And when it comes down to local decisions with regards to zoning changes and potential livestock systems coming into a community, the livestock industry, as well as the crops industry, needs to be there to say, look folks, this is important to our local economy. It's our bread and butter in non-metro Nebraska.
The Department of Agricultural Economics at UNL recently released a study on U.S. livestock industry trends and Nebraska's role. It details the state's beef, pork, dairy, and poultry sectors and how they compare to the rest of the nation. We'll link to that study on our website if you're interested in reading more. Poultry and egg production is a major ag industry in Nebraska, and Bill Claybaugh of Carroll is one of the state's leaders, according to the August Nebraska Farmer. In this month's issue, you can learn more about Bill and his nearly 40 years in the poultry industry. He and his sister Julie own Nebraska Eggs, which includes 500,000 laying hens, producing 10 million dozen eggs each year. They also own and operate TWJ Farms, TWJ Feed Mill, and Carroll Trucking. Bill is also the third generation in the Claybaugh family to be inducted into the Nebraska Poultry Hall of Fame. You can read more about Bill and the poultry sector in the August Nebraska Farmer. Much like Nebraska's corn crop, the state's soybeans are rolling through summer in fine shape. 72% of the crop is rated good or excellent. That's a large difference from this point last year when only 19% was in those best two categories. But with heavy rains in some areas, there could be some problem areas. At last Friday's Soybean Management Field Day in Waterloo, Lauren Giesler said he's noticing instances of Phytophthora in certain locations. While there's not much you can do about it now, finding it can help you make better management decisions in the future.
Phytophthora is a disease that can kill the soybean plant at any time. So one of the things that we'll see now, and I always tell people that now's a good time to scout actually if you're seeing dead and dying plants in the field. It is one of those fungal species out there that'll kill them at any time.
With some of the late and wet planting we had at the beginning of the year, did you see that in the beginning of the year as well?
Well, a little bit later, but most of it in the beginning was Pythium because it was cooler temperatures that we were in, and those cool soil temperatures favor that. So that was a little bit different, but now what we've seen is where we've had even some dry areas, but some of these really high amounts of rain coming in pockets, then about a week later, growers are saying they'll have plants in the field dying.
So why is it conducive to those situations?
Well, it's a disease that likes high moisture availability and free water. It needs free water to infect. So that's what we see is usually when we have heavy rain events, or an inch or 2 inches or something like that, which a lot of people have seen over the last few weeks, then we'll see it after that. The other time we see it often is in the wheel tracks. So in the pivot, this is a good time to scout a field, to just walk down the wheel tracks, and many times you'll see a plant that's dead or dying. And then the key to look for is a plant that has that dark stem discoloration at the base that runs up on the outside. And so if you see one that has that dark discoloration at the base going up into the canopy and the plant's wilting and dying, it's Phytophthora.
It is something you can self-diagnose?
It really is, yes it is.
Does it die immediately, the plant?
It's just a slow wilt, but it dies fairly quickly, and you'll be able to pick it out pretty easy. Now the key on it is, as far as management and such, this is something to really keep in the record books, and many growers may know they have Phytophthora in a field. When they do have that and they're seeing plants that are dying, that's where they need to let that field be kind of a bioassay to tell them to change the genes. There's different genes in varieties for resistance to Phytophthora, so they can use that as an indication. And then the other thing is to make sure they're using high tolerance as they select varieties for that field in the future.
When do you make that decision? I mean, how severe does it need to be before you decide to go to something like a resistant variety?
Well, I think the key is if they're seeing just a pocket, many times we'll just have a little wet spot in the field, maybe where water drains or something, and they just see it there. I'm not too worried about it, and I wouldn't expect them to. But when they're in a situation where they see plants scattered in the field, and even a low level of plants, and just an occasional plant in the field, that tells them that disease is throughout the field, and it's nibbling roots even though it's not killing plants. So they're going to benefit from resistance if they see anything where they see areas where they see an occasional dead plant.
Now with this week's weather forecast, here's UNL Extension state climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. Of course, we've started to see a return of the very warm conditions that have been missing from most of this summer. The only precipitation of any consequence that occurred during this last 7-day period, of course, was in that Wednesday night through Thursday time frame as a cold front tried to push its way southward. And we've seen some pretty significant moisture hitting portions of northeastern Nebraska. So the models underplayed the potential for this precipitation, but 2 inches plus was recorded in numerous locations from essentially Ainsworth over toward northern Iowa and portions of southern Minnesota. Unfortunately, as that system pushed southward toward the I-80 corridor, we've seen the precipitation totals drop off rather dramatically. And once you got south of the I-80 corridor, virtually nothing in the way of any significant moisture. So the major concern as we go forward in time, will we see any return of moisture, or are we going to have to endure an endless streak of unusually hot temperatures for this time of the year, which may allow the corn somewhat to catch up, but in the same token, if you're lacking moisture, when you have heat, We also have stress, and of course the concern is with filling soybean pods, and of course the potential for losing corn yield, particularly in the dryland environment where we start to see inadequate grain fill. So as we go forward in time, unfortunately it looks like the heat is here to stay with little opportunity for significant moisture, not only here in Nebraska, but most of the central and a good portion of the eastern Corn Belt. So let's take a look at the upper air model. This is a very simple forecast this week and see what we can expect. And here's that big upper air ridge that is really encompassing a good portion of the Corn Belt. And you'll notice a trough in the western United States is trying to work in, but it's butting up against this very strong ridge and is going absolutely nowhere. So we're getting that monsoonal moisture feed on the back side of this high pressure system. So all the activity will be directed to the west and to the north of Nebraska. For today, the best opportunity for any precipitation will be most likely in the panhandle, close to where this energy is moving around the western side of the ridge, but the farther east you get, really no significant moisture. And it doesn't improve as we go forward in time. The ridge remains locked in place. All the activity goes to our north on Sunday, and as we get into Monday, we actually see the ridge starting to back a little bit toward the west and actually intensifying, and we look to see some fairly warm temperatures really building into the region, with most of that activity directed well up into western Dakotas and southern Canada in terms of precipitation. Now, by the time we get to Tuesday, see that high is centered right over the central United States, and that means that Nebraska will share in the wealth in terms of warmth. We'll start to see our temperatures gradually increasing as the week progresses, and it appears that as we get into the Wednesday through Friday time frame with this high pressure system sitting over top of us, we will see our hottest temperatures of the 7-day period, and I would not be surprised that we'll see several instances of plus 100-degree readings, particularly across south central, southwestern Nebraska. Now, as we get into Thursday, that high pressure system still remains in place, really no change, and as we get into Friday, we start to see some signs that this might be moving toward the southwest, and as we get into next weekend, possibly flattening out and cooling our temperatures slightly. So when we look at the temperature forecast, consistently in the 90s across eastern Nebraska, with potentially upper 90s to near 100 in western Nebraska. 8 to 14-day forecast keeps that heat in place. In terms of precipitation, drier than normal trend. The only thing I will say is there is a cool shot potentially coming the first full weekend of September.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews with Jim Robb, Jerry Volesky, Jenny Reese, Bruce Johnson, and Lauren Giesler are available individually on the Market Journal website and mobile app as part of the August 23rd episode. Next week, Elaine Cubb will be our grain marketing analyst, and Greg Kruger will examine how row spacing in soybeans may affect yield. Until then, thanks for watching. From the 2013 Gudmundsen Sandhills Lab Open House near Whitman, I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.